This is the first generation Gerber Aquasaver toilet that's been around since at least the early 90s. This is one of Gerber's first attempts to get into the 1.6 gallon movement, and well, you're looking at it right now. I don't think I really need to explain much. So you're probably expecting me to criticize this toilet a lot considering all of its obvious flaws. Yes, and also kind of no. This is probably one of the weirdest toilets to come out of the 1.6 gallon era because it's pretty mixed. Now you might look at this and like, are you crazy? Well, yes, that's because I've experienced these a lot and they're a pretty mixed bag, and I'll show you why today. Let's go ahead and get an overall design, and you can already point out one of the flaws right there, being the very small trackway. While the passages are generic, they're pretty small. Inside the bowl, you've got a little bit of deepness to it, and there's the trackway opening, which is as small as it looks. That's also another blatant problem with this, is the small trackway. The opening and the passages are just ridiculously small. Here's a brief look inside the tank, and it is modified. The handle is newer, though I see it being replaced later. You have the protective covering right there to reduce it down to 1.6, although it's obviously broken. And the fluid master fill valve is replacement. Typically these have ball cocks. Not much needs to be said there, but of course, unsurprisingly, the cover to reduce the water usage is broken, often leading to these having pretty long flushes, as you can see. Now let's have a look at a flush. For a front flusher, it actually does not have a pretty bad flush. It actually is pretty fast and pretty efficient. Although flushes do differ, this one has definitely one of the more shorter flushes I've seen. Now let's talk about performance, because it gets a little bit weird here. Now if you find a round bowl version of this, expect it to perform pretty poorly, because not only does it have a small trackway, but the bowl size also doesn't really work well with the bowl, which means those clog fairly easily. Now, about the elongated versions, they actually don't perform too terrible, and you might think I'm crazy, but I'm being real. I have put up with several of these, and I've never clogged one, despite how ridiculously flawed it is. I think the reason being is that there is a little bit more space in the bowl for it to work around and not clog as much compared to its round bowl variant. Now let's talk about ball rings. This is pretty self-explanatory. You notice on this one, this ball rinse is very scattered, which means the ball rinse is unsurprisingly crap. And it's pretty much the same for most of these, so not much is different. Another problem I want to bring up is the kind of inconsistent siphons and the pulls. The pulls themselves are generally fine, but the siphon is where my problem is. Take a look at this one, for example. And that one's a little bit short, and the siphons tend to be very variant between each one. Some may be too short, some may not even have any at all, although I've yet to see that, and some of them are pretty long, which means the inconsistent siphons do play an effect in the pull not being as great as it should be, but the siphon itself definitely lacks a little bit, but the pull itself is fine enough, I guess. And that is the first generation Gerber Aquasaver, probably one of the weirdest toilets I've ever seen. And it's a very mixed bag too, depending on what style you get, whether it's round or elongated. Obviously round does worse, but elongated actually doesn't do as bad, but it's still pretty mixed. So let's grade it. Alright, I'm going to do something different for this review. I'm doing a split score, but based on bowl shape. I'm going to do round versus elongated. Round will have red text, elongated will have green text, and black will apply to both scores. So I thought I'd get that away because this is going to be a confusing mess. So let's get started. For starters, I don't really care for the design of this toilet. Now the tank itself is fine. In fact, I do like it on the Ultra Flush and even the first gen Gerber Maxwell. And the tank works perfectly well on the Aquasavers too. The first gen though has this very cheap bowl design though that I just don't really like. You could just look at it and you could tell, yeah, this has a little bit of cheapness to it, and I just don't really care for it. Obviously excluding the trapway problems, which we'll get to shortly, but it is also worth noting that this also had a Mount Vernon tank back in the early 1990s, until 1994 when it got switched over to the Aquasaver tank. I'm still giving it a 4 though, regardless of what tank it has, because I just don't really like the bowl design. The tank parts are okay. They're nothing to write home about. They work perfectly fine, although I don't ever recall seeing a ball cock in quite a while in one of these. And obviously the biggest thing is the protective covering to reduce down the water usage, which most of the time does not last. Therefore, a lot of the flushes on these can be pretty long. And that can really go for any early 1.6 gallon toilet. Most of them have this protective covering and it's pretty cheap. Besides that, the tank parts are perfectly fine and they get a 6. As with most early 1.6 gallon toilets, the quality control, unsurprisingly, is pretty crap. Not only are the rim jets very inconsistent, but the flushes themselves also don't really help out that much either with siphoning. These things can have very random siphons, and it really depends on the flush. And it really depends on the quality control, which is, like I mentioned, pretty crap. So, because of that, I'm giving the quality control a 3. The trapway itself is painfully generic, but the problem is that it's very small. The opening is small, even the passages themselves look very small. This, in return, doesn't really give a good look to this toilet at all, despite what scores I'm going to give it, depending on when I split it up. But regardless, I'm giving the trapway a 3. I'm surprised I'm not giving it a score any lower, but you'll see why later. For a front flusher, the flush is actually not bad at all. It's quite quick and very powerful. It looks almost like it's on steroids almost. Honestly, I kind of like it. Even though it's a front flusher, I kind of like the flush on this a lot. Pretty good for what it is, but I'm only giving it a 6 because it's a front flusher. While the pulls themselves are pretty good and powerful, the siphon is where you might want to get concerned about. It's a bit inconsistent, and it's like that because of the quality control being pretty crap overall on this toilet. Most of the time you'll get pretty long siphons and stuff, but sometimes you'll get short siphons like this one. Now in this case it's because the water level is pretty low in the tank, but I have seen other videos where the siphons are very short even if they have normal tanks or even have longer flushes. So that's something to consider. Because of that, I'm giving it a 5. Now we'll start doing the split scores. Now the performance of the round ball versions are pretty horrible. And that not only equates to the smaller trapway, but because of the smaller bowl size as well. It just does not work out and it gets a 2. Now for the elongated versions, here's where it gets weird. Honestly, for what it is, it's not horrible. I mean, granted, it can sometimes be iffy at best, but keep in mind, I've put up with 2 of these on several occasions a month for over 15 years. I've never clogged one, at all. And keep in mind, these are very hit or miss performers in general. So the fact that I've not clogged one is kind of reassuring that maybe these aren't as bad as they look, but only for the elongated versions. At the end of the day though, I'm giving it a 5 because of its pretty hit or miss performance. Because these can be a bit unpredictable with performance, but shockingly it's not as bad as I thought it would be. One of the most common problems with front flushes is the terrible ball rinse, and this is no different. For the round ball version, I'm giving it a 3 because it has a little bit less area to cover compared to the elongated versions. Considering the poor quality control of these toilets, sometimes the back rim is often very missed, and sometimes it looks like it's not covered at all, which is kind of ridiculous. With that in mind, I'm giving it a 2. They really could have done better in this spot. Much better. It really should be shocking not giving the survivability a 2 on the round ball versions. But here's where it gets very weird. The elongated versions can last a pretty good long time, shockingly. Let me tell you guys a quick story. So, there's this one first-gen Gerber Aquasaver covered height elongated toilet at a diner I constantly go to. In the woman's restroom, there was originally a 1995 Briggs Ultima, like a first generation, and it got replaced, which honestly shouldn't be shocking. But here's the crazy part. The toilet that replaced it, a 2011 first-gen Aquasource Henshaw, didn't even last as long as the Ultima. It lasted 9 years, before it got replaced in 2020 with its current toilet, a round bowl American Standard Champion 4. So, not only did the first-gen Gerber Aquasaver in the men's room outlasted the original Briggs Ultima, but it outlasted its replacement toilet. And that's in the woman's! How insane is that? A toilet with a tiny trapway outlasting not only the original toilet in the woman's restroom, but its replacement as well. It's insane to think about. These things have very strong footholds, and I cannot explain to you why that is. I've seen these toilets outlast a lot of early 1.6 gallon toilets, which is kind of insane to think about, considering that you would think I don't expect it to last that long. But there's still quite a couple around me. It's kind of insane to think about. And frankly speaking, I never really see these clog. I think the closest thing I saw was one getting snaked. But that's it. And keep in mind, I've been seeing 2 consistently for the last 15 years. That's insane to think about. And it makes your head hurt thinking, how did this happen? Why did this happen? And honestly, you might think I'm crazy for this. I'm giving the survivability a 7 on the elongated versions. Where have we gone? Now let's talk about the overall value of these toilets. For the round bowl, there really isn't much value. Sure, the flush is good for what it is, but everything else works against it. The bowl rinse, the performance, and just a tiny trapway gives it a score of a 2 on the round bowl versions. For the elongated versions, I kinda don't mind these, but let's be completely real here, they're pretty flawed. Sure, the performance might be a little bit better on the elongated versions, but the bowl rinse sucks a little bit more. And then you gotta consider the quality control. It's just crap. I mean, that's kind of expected for an early 1.6 gallon toilet. Most of the quality is pretty crap, which is not really surprising. But you consider that problem and some of the issues that it comes up with. The inconsistent rim jet usage and the inconsistent siphons sometimes. It kind of makes it look out like it's a mess. But at the same time, it could have been a lot worse. It's not as terrible as you think it is, but there was definite room for improvement. If it wasn't for the problems I listed, this actually would have had a higher score. But let's be real here, it has its problems. If they actually just improved upon this design, make the trapway bigger, improve for quality control, this actually would be a pretty bad toilet. And it actually would be a little bit more common today. But as it stands, I'm just shocked that this toilet is not as bad as I was expecting, but it's pretty flawed. So I'm giving it a 4. Now it's time to talk about the final scores of the first generation Gerber Aquasaver toilets. For the round ball version, it gets a 36 out of 100. But for the elongated versions, it gets a 46 out of 100. A 10-point difference. Quite interesting, honestly. I don't really have a lot of positives to say about the round ball versions. They are as bad as you might think they are. But the elongated versions kind of surprised me a little bit. Sure, it has a lot of flaws, like the trapway design, the quality control being crap, the bowl rinse sucking, but at the same time, there are some slightly redeeming qualities, like the flush being good, and even the performance not being as bad for what it is. But being completely honest here, they definitely could have improved upon this design. Honestly, I'm kind of shocked that one of these forms is not as bad as I thought it would compared to another, but at the same time, they really could have done better.